is Leslie Meredith with Breakbulk Events and Media. We have just finished our keynote address here in Houston, and I have our keynote speaker, Melanie Kenderdine from Energy Futures, and she did just a phenomenal presentation, so I'm really excited that she's here to share it with you. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you had so many facts, figures presented so well. What are, would you say, let's go with 3 takeaways that are most important for people to understand as far as what's going on in the energy market in the U.S. today?
Well, we have a target for net zero by 2050. And so putting together a range of policies to meet net zero, I think, is hugely, hugely important. But I also think that those policies need to be very thoughtful and sequenced. And I'll give you an example of why. Europe has EU, very green focus. And but after Russia cut off natural gas to Ukraine, they needed our natural gas. So, and the U.S. is the #1 producer of natural gas in the world. Russia cut off 22 BCM of natural gas to Europe. The U.S. provided 19 BCM of that loss. So when I say thoughtful, sequenced, climate change is a huge issue, but we need to worry about energy security as well. So how we transition our energy systems to clean energy systems, which I do believe we need to do. I think climate change is an existential threat to the planet. We need to transition, but we need to be very smart about it and do it in ways that don't leave us in 5 years with no gas when we need it.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, you talked a lot about offshore wind, which is, I feel like it's finally getting off the ground, if you will, here, where Europe's had it for, 20 years maybe? So how does that look, and what's the potential for people that you see here at Breakbulk Americas and others?
Well, the President Biden has set a target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And so that's a huge driver for offshore wind. And one of the figures I showed shows all the states in the U.S. that have renewable portfolio standards or goals. Not surprisingly, all but a few of them are on the coasts, and or the Great Lake coast. And so offshore wind, obviously important to states on the coast. 80% of electricity demand in the United States is on the coast and in Great Lakes. So you got huge electricity demand. You have offshore potential. One other thing I think is very important in a place like New England, they don't have space onshore to build a huge amount of wind, okay? They need offshore because it's a space-constrained area, and New England is moving forward very quickly on offshore wind. So offshore wind meets a lot of drivers, renewable portfolio standards, space constraints, and huge electricity demand on the coasts, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you talked about investment in infrastructure in ports, vessels, and some other things. Can you just give us a snapshot of that, and just so people can understand the magnitude that you're talking about?
The National Renewable Energy Technology Laboratory, that's a DOE laboratory, estimated that by 2030, we need $23.4 billion of investment, something like that. I'm remembering it off the top of my head, but and of that, actually it's 22.4. Of that, 51% of the investment that they think we need is in ports. 8 billion of that is in ports. 3.5 billion is in vessels for offshore wind. And so like 51% of the investment that we need is in two categories out of maybe 10. Two categories, ports and vessels. And for obvious reasons, we need to upgrade our ports to handle offshore wind. An offshore wind turbine, I showed a picture of it. GE has an offshore wind turbine that is almost as tall as the Eiffel Tower. So at the ports, you need, the turbine blades are huge, very long. You need space at ports, laydown areas for these enormous parts, and they're very heavy too. So you need wharves that can handle very heavy equipment. You also need to think about production facilities of your wind turbine blades. They need to be nearby the ports because you can't transport them on roads. Okay, so you need a whole set of infrastructure, et cetera, in order to enable the ports and support the production near the ports that you need for offshore wind, and the vessels that you need. There are a whole range of types of vessels: crew vessels, installation vessels, all of, repairs, et cetera, et cetera. And when I looked at the NREL numbers, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory numbers, we need like 86 to 99 vessels by 2030 to meet the president's targets of 20 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030.